Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my post-race reaction for the China or Shanghai GP race. What was your thoughts on this race? Did the one stop surprise you? Did it provide enough excitement with that pit strategy element in it? Did it not, cause enough on-track action? Or was there people just kind of putting around and keeping those positions and keeping those tires alive more than you were expecting, and so it kind of dulled down the expectations and the excitement you had for this race? Or did that provide more excitement because were they going to be able to hold on to those tires and keep those people behind them in that running? I thought it was a decent race. I wasn't one of the best races I had, but I'd probably give it a good 6 or 7 out of 10 rating because it was fairly decent. And, with those one tire strategy or the one pit stop strategy for those long, hard tire stints, it made it kind of interesting in regard to how they played out once they figured that out from, Stroll and Gasly going on those hard tires. So in that regard, it was fairly decent, but on the on-track action was a little bit duller than I was expecting it to be, even though the pit strategies kind of threw things up for a loop in different points in time. And of course, we had a couple of teams that went with a 2-pit strategy anyway, and they kind of fell back in the pack from that front pack, which kind of disappointed a lot of people in that regard as well. Like normal, I go from the back of the pack to the front of the pack, talking about each driver and how I think they did and any kind of insights I can give for why they ended up where they did. And as we know, some things have happened since the finish of the race. So we'll start off with Pierre Gasly, who started in 16th position, had a really good qualifying, outdoing his teammate, gained 3 positions on the first lap, had that one-stop race going, pitting early from that medium set on lap 10 to that hard set and going the rest of the way. So doing a really good job there. He did pass Hulkenberg for the 15th position on lap 19, but he ended up having a disqualification and would have finished in 11th if that disqualification was not in place. Now, he got disqualified because his car was 1 kilogram underweight. So that kind of hurt him in that regard. So they'll have to figure out why that happened in general, if it was the fuel or if it was skid plates or something else that was going on with that Alpine. But they ended up, under that weight limit, so they have been disqualified. Now we have Lewis Hamilton coming in 19th, being disqualified as well. He had a good start, starting off in 6th position ahead of his teammate Leclerc. He gained 1 spot on the first lap. He had a 2-stop race, starting off on mediums and going on the hards on lap 13, and then stopped again on lap 37 for another set of hards. He did pass Lawson for 8th on lap 16, passed Stroll for 6th on lap 19, and then he was swapped with his teammate for 5th with Leclerc, so he kind of dropped back a position there and would have finished in 6th if he wasn't not disqualified. So a decent run from those Ferrari, but unfortunately that Ferrari has had excessive plank wear, and so it was not found to be the 9 millimeters that it should be, but 8.6 or 8.5, depending on where you checked. So he was disqualified in that Ferrari as well. He would have had the fastest lap, even though it doesn't count for any points, so I marked that out as well. Now, his teammate was disqualified as well, but for a different reason. He kind of lined up the same as Pierre Gasly, being underweight by 1 kilogram. He started in 5th position, just behind his teammate, gained 1 spot at the very first of the lap, and he had contact with Lewis to start early on, which damaged his front wing, which he is able to drive the rest of the way on, and that probably hurt him a little bit, or could have helped him, and some of the commentary seemed to think that as he was going around this area. He had a 1-stop race, stopping on lap 15, switching from those set of mediums to a set of hards. He did pass Lawson on lap 16 for 9th, passed Stroll for 6th on lap 19, and then swapped with Lewis for that 4th position. As I said, he would have finished in 5th, so that would have been a really good result for the Ferraris in this regard, with all the issues that they were having, but unfortunately they were disqualified for being underweight. Now we get to that 17th position for Fernando Alonso, who qualified in 13 ahead of Stroll, his teammate, so he did a good job there. gained a spot on the first lap, so everything was going well, but then he had a brake failure, and it's reported that his brakes were on fire and potentially his brake well went to the floorboard, so he didn't have any brakes left in that Aston Martin, so he had to pit on lap 4 to retire that car. And that gives us out of the marking, and he was pretty early on that as well, so it's kind of strange that the failure of that brakes happened so quick, so they'll have to look into that and try to figure out what happened in that regard, but hopefully they can fix that going into Japan. And then we get to a disappointing Yuki Tsunoda, who started in 9th, so doing a good job there, but still behind his teammate on the qualifying, gained a position on the start of the lap, passed Doohan for 14th on lap 46th, then had a weird front wing failure that caused him to have to pit. He was kind of like in the back of the turbulent air, and that somehow weird, maybe a resonance or something to the effect, ended up breaking that front wing. If you saw that video, he didn't even come close to the back of the car in front of him, yet that front wing kind of failed in line with that rear tire for that turbulent air that was coming over that front car. He was having another issue, so he ended up having to have a 3 pit stop strategy, which hurt him. So he pitted early on lap 11, switching from mediums to hards, then pitted again on lap 35 for another set of hards, and then because of that wing damage, he had to pit again on lap 46, which dropped him out of contention for getting any kind of points in that running. And I know they were kind of edging pretty far up there to start off with, so that kind of hurt them. Hopefully they can bounce back in Japan, as they've seem to have a very good running. Generally, just had some bad luck kind of come their way in that Racing Bulls. Then we come to Nico Hülkenberg, who had a good qualifying, starting in 12th ahead of his teammate Bortoleto. Lost 7 positions on the start of the lap. So I watched that again, and I couldn't see anything that was issues. He was just kind of getting a little bit of squirrely. Tires weren't quite warmed up that he was on or something to that effect. So he was not really getting hit as far as I could see, just trying to avoid, the collisions and stuff going around, and ended up losing 7 spots, which is not quite like Nico to start off with. But that seems to have what happened in that first lap. He did a 1 stop, stopped on lap 20, switching from mediums to a set of hards. Then we come to his teammate, Bortoleto, who started in 19th, so pretty far back there, but lost a spot at the very beginning when he spun behind Behrman. So he didn't actually come into contact, but he was trying to avoid that. I think he was coming in a little bit hot or something to that effect, and put in the brakes a little harder than he should have, and spun around and got off the track, which pushed him back into that 20th position. But he was able to come back and do decently after that. Not quite as well as he would have liked, but a decent job to recover from that position. He did a 2-stop pit strategy. Of course, that first lap, he went in and pitted from the set of mediums to a set of hards after spinning and flat spotting those tires. And then he went to lap 26 before going to another set of hards. And then he did actually pass Hülkenberg on lap 46 for that 18th position. Then we come to Jack Doohan. Jack Doohan started in 18th, not that great of a spot for him. He did gain 1 spot at the first lap. He did a 1-stop race, stopping on lap 11 on a set of mediums, switching to that set of hards. He did have a little bit of action on track. He passed Behrman on lap 2 for that 16th position, passed Hülkenberg on lap 20 for 15th, passed Yuki on lap 46 for that 14th position. And then at the end, he was having a really good fight with Hajar, going back and forth in that battle throughout the last, 5 to 10 laps. Unfortunately, that's kind of hurt him in that regard, because one of those times he actually ended up pushing Hajar off the track a little bit, and that cost him a 10-second penalty, so forcing him back into the back of the pack. That hurt him quite a bit, so he'll have to learn from that to try to figure out if he can eliminate those mistakes and keep him in the running, even though he did a decent job of, having that battle, trying to keep Isaac Hajar behind him in those last laps. Then we come to Liam Lawson, who had a horrible race. I don't know what's going on with him. I really liked Liam Lawson when he came in last season and did a few races. It seems like he has been lost ever since he came into that Red Bull, so I'm not sure if that Red Bull is that much harder to drive than the other cars that he was in, or if there's something else going on with Liam Lawson. But he started in the pit lane in that 20th position. He did a decent start, gaining 2 positions on that first lap. He had a 2-stop pit strategy, stopping at lap 18 from set of hards to a set of mediums. And then on the lap 30, he switched those mediums back to a set of hards. And then he did pass Hulkenberg on lap 33 for that 17th position. So he was kind of in the back, struggling a lot with those tires, really having a hard time with that with his teammates way up front. I know he's not doing that great on those tires, but at least a lot farther up ahead during that qualifying session and be able to manage the tires probably a little bit better. So he has a lot of work to do. Hopefully that can kind of come together a little bit more and gel with that team in Japan and hopefully not get replaced in those first 3 races. Now I can see him, if it continues on, getting replaced fairly quickly, but I think they're probably going to give him a couple more races to kind of iron things out before they do that. But it is Red Bull, so you never know how quickly they will act. Then we come to Isaac Hydjar, the last, right before the point positions. And he had a good qualifying, starting in 7th ahead of his teammate Yuki. So he outdid his teammate in the qualifying session, which was really cool. He did lose 2 spots in the first lap, so that's not as good. So he needs to work on that first lap issues, trying to make sure he's in the right position without, causing, contact or damage to that Racing Bull. He was doing fairly good. And then, of course, the Racing Bulls decided to go with that 2-stop pit strategy. So he pitted on lap 12 from that set of mediums to a set of hards, and then went to lap 33 for switching to another set of hards. And that second pit stop kind of pushed them back in the backfield where they were just outside those points range. So unfortunately that kind of happened, and so they need to work on their strategy a little bit better, understand that car, and kind of look at the people around them and see how they are reacting to those conditions. Because like all the other teams were probably going for a 2-pit strategy as well, but they saw how well that hard was, holding up and keeping up with those paces, and so they switched those strategies in the moment to try to work into those hard tires to get the most out of those. So that was really good to see. Hopefully they can do all of that. And he did a good fight with Doohan, as I said, going back and forth in that battle. I know he's getting kind of frustrated, kind of being, in that behind Doohan, but that'll get him to learn and get him to teach how to get around those drivers in those weird situations. So a really good run, I think, for Isaac Hydjar, even though it doesn't show quite as much in this position, even though we had a couple disqualifications which pushed him up higher. Then we make it to the top 10, where Carlos Sainz finds himself in that last position to get a point. It's really good to see that Williams up there. I know he's still struggling, trying to learn that Williams car, but putting a lot of pressure on Alex Albon, and Alex Albon is reacting to that, doing a really good job this season. Sainz is still trying to adjust himself to try to figure out and get the most out of that Williams, but it's still good to see that he can make it into the points. He started in 15th, so a little bit farther back than his teammate. He had a 1-stop pit strategy, going to lap 17 on a set of mediums before switching to a set of hards. And he did pass Doohan on lap 24 for that 15th position. And he kind of kept himself clean, having himself in that running, and ended up finding himself into that last point range, which is good for Williams, as I said, keeping them in that running, jumping them a couple of constructors standings in that as well. Then we come to Lance Stroll, who is probably one of the stars of this race, in the sense of he started off on those hard tires, and he started in 14th position, but behind his teammate, but he ended up having a 1-stop, starting on hard tires, went to lap 36 on those hard tires before switching to that set of mediums for the rest of the race. So that gave a lot of the other teams that data that they were looking for how well the hards lasted. With, Pierre Gasly switching to the hard tires earlier on, kind of helped them, figure out what their strategy was to make sure that it was a 1-stop pit strategy instead of a 2-stop. He also did pass Carlos Sainz for 12th on lap 43 to get into that position. And then we come to Oliver Behrman, who did a really good job in that Haas, coming back from 17th position where he started. Had a good first lap and passed one person on that first lap. He had a 1-stop, winning all the way on lap 26 for that set of hards, which is fairly early for that set of hards before switching to a set of mediums. So he went a long stint on that medium, which is kind of different than most of the other teams, but he was able to handle that. He did pass Doohan on lap 2 for 16th, passed Gasly on lap 12 for 16th, passed Lawson on lap 17 for 9th, and then passed Lawson again on lap 31 for 16th, passed Doohan on lap 33 for 15th, passed Sainz on lap 36 for 13th, and then passed Gasly on lap 40 for 10th. So he had a lot of action on track, keeping himself going, pushing himself up into that front running position. So he deserves all the points that he can get. Now, originally that was just the last point, but because of the disqualifications, he got bumped up into that 8th position. Then we get to Alex Albon, who started off in 10th ahead of his teammate Sainz, lost 1 position on that first lap. He had a 1-stop pit strategy going to lap 20 on that set of mediums, so a decent run there before switching to a set of hards. And he did pass Gasly on lap 23 for that 13th position. So he did a really good job in that Williams to get them back up into that running. He was up there in the lead at one point because he went long in that first stint on that medium set of tires. And due to that strategy, he was able to keep himself into that running, doing a really good job with those changes that they made on that Williams in this run. At one point, he was saying they're trying to make him pit, and he's like, no, I'm fine. Everybody else is having issues. I'm perfectly cool with these, tires as they were. So he was doing a really good job in that Williams in that new configuration. So it kind of hurts that he's not higher up in this running, but he did a really good job in that, in my view. And I think that helped them in that concepts as well. And then you come to Kimi Antonelli, who started in 8th. He gained a position on that first lap. He had a 1-pit strategy as well, stopping on lap 12 from those mediums and switching to a set of hards. And then had a clean race the rest of the way and somehow got driver of the day. I think he seems to be fairly popular since that last race that he was in. It was able to wet, kind of shining how he can perform. And then coming back to this dry race, keeping clean, kind of gave him that opportunity. I probably would have given it to Oscar as he kind of led the way. He was able to squeeze out that qualifying session and keep, George behind him in that front running for this race, keeping him in the lead so that he can actually, perform and run the race to his own liking. Even though he had some threats earlier on, he was able to, solidify that. So I think the driver of the day probably would have gone to Oscar if it wasn't really going to Kimi in my viewpoint. But what was your viewpoint? We can get to Esteban Ocon, who did another good job for Haas, starting in 11th ahead of his teammate Behrman. So a really good qualifying session in that Haas when we didn't think that Haas was going to be that well, especially since that qualifying session and sprint race aspects of this weekend, we thought they were going to be falling behind. And last weekend's, GP race didn't turn out as well as we were hoping they would do for that Haas. So when they came back strong in this qualifying session, it was really good to see. He did have 1 spot that he gained on that first lap. He did a 1 pit stop strategy, stopping on lap 11, switching from mediums to a set of hards, and he did pass Kimi on that kind of really going off into the grass just a little bit to pass Kimi on lap 15 for that 14th position. And then keeping out of the way, keeping in those runnings and get that pit strategy to keep him up there in the lead and making good points for Haas. And then it's kind of strange going from Esteban Ocon to Max Verstappen, but that's where Max Verstappen ended up in 4th. He started in 4th ahead of his teammate Lawson, of course. So decent job, not quite the job we were hopefully hoping for after that sprint race coming into that bit. But he was going to put some pressure, we thought, in this race that kind of hurt him a little bit, I think, in the overall aspect of it. And unlike Max, he lost 2 positions on that first lap, which hurt him a little bit more, I think. I think he was just trying to stay clear of everything that was going on ahead of him. But in that regard, I think it could have hurt him in those tire runnings, so it didn't quite play out as he would have liked. He did a 1 pit stop strategy, stopping on lap 13 from that set of mediums to a set of hards. And he did pass Charles Leclerc on lap 53 for that 4th position. So a decent job for Max, but not quite where we were expecting them to be. I think that Red Bull's struggling a little bit more in this regard. So hopefully the Japanese GP race will have a little bit more edge towards those Red Bulls, and we'll see a little bit more action up front from those Red Bulls getting that first position, putting a little more pressure on the front runners. Then we have George Russell, who did a good job, I think, overall, even though it shows that he lost a spot starting off in second, ended up in third. He did, gain that position ahead of his teammate, so good qualifying for him. He did lose that spot at the very beginning of the race, even though as bad looked there, I think it was decent because he was really putting pressure to go for the lead during that time as well. So he did have a one pit stop strategy, stopping on lap 14 from the set of mediums to a set of hards. That said, he did have a good start, getting up there, almost getting into first place, but having to have Oscar kind of block him in that corner and kind of put him in that box where he couldn't quite go around because Lando ended up going around the outside of him during that first stint, losing that position on that first corner. So I think he was really close to getting that first position, and so I think that's what kind of makes it elevate that run for him a little bit more than it is. Now, he got up there, got behind the McLarens, and did a decent job there. I think it wasn't the best job, but I think with that Mercedes, it's not quite up to par with the McLarens and the overall race pace. So they needed a little bit of work there, but overall, I think he did a really good job in this race. And then, of course, we have Lando Norris, who came in second, started off in third. He did gain one position, as I said, passing George on that first corner. And then he had a one pit stop strategy, stopping on lap 15 from that set of mediums to a set of hards. He passed George again on lap 18 for that third position after pitting. And then he had some pedal issues, which kept him, in that second position. I know he was kind of trying to have those tires in a good condition later in the race so that he could actually race his teammate Oscar in those last laps to potentially gain that first position. I know early on he kind of put some pressure on Oscar, but Oscar didn't relinquish and have a mistake, so he kind of backed off, and he was going to save his tires and the fuel for later in the race. And then they had that other issue with the pedal coming into play that kind of kept him from doing that, so that hurt him overall, but at least he didn't have a total brake failure during that and drop him back into the pack. So he was good to be able to wing that as much as he could, not putting super hard brake pressure on that and keeping George Russell behind him. Even though there was quite a bit of gap there, it kind of shrank down very significantly during those last few laps when it was getting a really critical point in those pedals for him. So I think he did a really good job overall, even though he came in second and didn't really put what we would have liked, some action to try to pass Oscar during this race. I think we would have liked to seen a little bit more front action in that to potentially take that first position or swapping positions back and forth during this race. But as a whole, I think Lando did a really good job, and of course McLaren did a good job of trying to manage both drivers in that regard so that they didn't have that contact or issues during this race. Lando got the fastest lap after Lewis, and so that's why I marked him with the fastest lap, just because Lewis's disqualification. Otherwise it would have gone to Lewis, and of course it doesn't count for anything, so it doesn't really matter for the point wise anyway. Now we come to Oscar Piastri, who did an excellent job. He put it on pole, outdid his pole position on that same qualifying stint on that Q3 session, where he was able to go out ahead when other people were kind of having a hard time with that last run. So I think he did a really good job qualifying, staying ahead of his teammate in qualifying as well. He had a one pit stop strategy, stopping just ahead of his teammate on lap 14, switching from those set of mediums to a set of hards. And he had a good start where he blocked George to keep him behind, to keep that first position, so he didn't have to try to fight George that much during this stint. And then he passed Albon on lap 17 for that first position after he pitted, and came back out behind Albon because Albon didn't pit at that point in time. And then he was having to have to get caught back up to Albon and then pass him on that 17th lap. And then he was basically, keeping that first position the rest of the race, not getting really that much pressure from Lando generally, and just managing the race overall. So a really good job for Oscar in that running as we went through. And just to show you how that race went overall, on lap 5, he had a 0.7 second lead over Lando. At lap 10, he had a 2.1 second lead over Lando. And due to the pit strategy, on lap 15, when I was recording this, it was Lando over Leclerc with 5.4 seconds. But by lap 25, he was back in the lead and had a 4.2 second lead over Lando Norris. And lap 40, he had a 2.7 second lead over Lando Norris. And then at the end, it was a 9.7 second lead. And of course, we had that pedal issue with Lando for that last stint. So that could have played into that bigger gap there, not having that quite the shrinkage that we might have wanted to see on that, first to second positions. But overall, I think he was able to, lead and keep his race the way he wanted it, even though I think they weren't really planning on going for that one-stop strategy. He was able to maintain those tires and deal decent enough and keep in the lead without putting, too much pressure on him to keep the people behind him overall. So a good job for Oscar. And I said he probably would have gotten the driver of the day. So what did this do for the drivers' championship? What we get, after all the disqualifications, we have Carlos Sainz now in that 14th spot with 1 point. Yuki Tsunoda drops down to 13th with 3 points. Oliver Bamron makes his way up to 12th now with 4. Nico Hülkenberg drops to 11th. So is Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton. Lance Stroll stays the same, but he's tied now with Esteban Ocon for that 7th position. And then Alex Albon gets 16 points, with Kimi getting 22, but dropping back behind Oscar Piastri, who now jumps up to that 4th spot with 34 points. George Russell is just 1 point away from Max Verstappen with 35 over Max's 36. And of course, Lando Norris is in the lead with 44. And for the constructor standings, we have Alpine with the only team and constructor that has not scored yet. And so with that issue with Gasly, that kind of hurts them quite a bit, I think, in this running. I'm sure they will gather themselves back up and push forward, but still a decent job for Alpine, even though they haven't got any points. Now, Racing Bull is another one that only has 3 points, and they could have, scored quite a big in that last race, if not some issues and not some pit strategies that pushed them back into that field. So they're kind of hurting as well into that 9th position. Then we have Kick Sauber with 6 still, and then you have Aston Martin, gaining 2 points into that 10-point marker, but dropping back to that 7th position, where Haas has jumped up ahead of them into that 6th point, getting 14 points. Ferrari drops back behind Williams in this with 17 points. They're tied now, but Williams has gotten the more significance out of that. So they are now with 17 points into that 4th position. Then, of course, you have Red Bull with 36, Mercedes with 57, and McLaren leading the way with 78. So what is coming up next? We have the Japan or Suzuka race. Not next weekend, but the weekend after. So we have a weekend off before we have race week again. It was first introduced in 1987. It has a lap length of 3.608 miles and will have 53 laps run for a total race distance of 191.054 miles. And the lap record holder is Lewis Hamilton from 2019 with 1 minute 30.983 seconds. So until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.